Spero.
Popcorn therapy. Holistic health and wellness through the lens of pop culture. Right, so welcome to Popcorn Therapy. We're going to be talking about Kaos today, the Netflix show that is based on Greek mythology. And I am so excited to have Natalie Rousseau with me on this podcast. She has been a teacher of mine in many ways, a yoga teacher for a while, also a witch teacher. And if there are any baby witches out there that want to have an experience with her, she's got a lot of beautiful online courses that a lot of sort of what I learned about seasonal wellness and stuff comes from her. And also in a chapter of a book that's going to be coming out of mine next year, I wrote a chapter on Persephone that was actually greatly inspired by a version that Natalie wrote within one of those courses. So Natalie knows some things about mythology. We're both therapists. We're both, well, ex-yoga teachers, sort of maybe still doing that. So we're quite parallel in our paths. So welcome, Natalie, and please feel free if there's anything else you want to say to kind of introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm excited to be here with you and to just see where this conversation takes us. And yeah, I just agree. I think of you as a teacher, a friend, a colleague, and we have these parallel paths. And I'm just excited to have a conversation with you. It's been a while. So
it has been.
This is a great focus. This
great excuse to catch up a little.
Yeah.
Okay, so Kaos. We will be talking about spoilers because we have to. They are Greek myths. I guess the thing that can be spoiled is how they reinterpret these Greek myths. So you may know some endings, but the show kind of does it in some different ways. In case anyone doesn't know the show or just needs a little refresher, we've got Jeff Goldblum as a highly psychopathic Zeus. And the mode is, actually, it reminds me a little bit of Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet. It's this very dramatic, modern time city, but that's very heavily influenced by religion. So in this case, it's the Greek gods, the Olympian gods that are worshipped. I heard a podcast the other day that called it the Marvelization of Greek mythology, which I thought was kind of an interesting way to put it because it brings them into the present. It kind of shows these Greek gods a little bit as superheroes, but there are also some of the gods are brought down to earth as human beings like Orpheus and Eurydice, and there's a lot of the story unfolds within the underworld. So that's basically kind of what's happening there. And I think we can just start with general impressions. Like, Natalie, what did you think about the show?
I love that you brought in that sort of parallel to that Romeo and Juliet. I really felt that very strongly. And not as much as the Marvelization, but I get what that person meant by that. And two things. First, because we have our own images in our mind of these gods. It's always sometimes, I think, a little bit like shocking when you see someone else's interpretation. So my first impression was, I love this. This is so fun, like so campy, so wild. And just, it's always delightful for me to be brought into the world of the Greek myths. I love retellings of any mythology. And also there's places where it's like, oh, that's not congruent with how I conceive of it or how my romantic vision of something might be. And that was maybe some of my very first impressions. And the more I got into the series, the more I loved it. Even though, there are some characters that's not how, if I made that series, how I might portray them, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I sort of think of the show as fan fiction a little bit. And, as fans of Greek mythology, maybe, you and I think have some intimacy with certain stories and some closeness with, maybe Persephone specifically. And so watching some of these characters come to life in someone else's imagination is very interesting. And, mythology itself, generally it was shared orally. There were different versions depending on the city you were in, depending on who was telling the story. Certain people would be seen more as heroes or they'd be seen more as villains. Like, myths are quite conducive to flexibility. You can tell and retell them. They're also meant to reflect the values and realities of that historical context as well. So I think there can be a lot of value to the way this writer, director sort of pulled these mythologies into the present with themes like authoritarianism, terrorism, migration, religious belief. There were a lot of pieces that I think you can relate to our modern times quite well. There were also a lot of moments of watching that I thought was interesting. Like there was the moment when the Furies, who are reimagined as a motorcycle gang, which I think is very cool. They come in to help Ariadne understand the truth about her prophecy and her past and her father and everything. And they show her on this kind of silly, it almost looks like a sitcom, you know? Like this with this character, your dad, and this character, your mom, and this character, your brother, who actually wasn't murdered, you know. And there's also the moment when Zeus has gathered all the Olympians together for a barbecue, which is significant because, of course, they loved the sacrifices and the smoke from the sacrifices, to try to figure out if King Minos could defy his prophecy. And they kind of gather around a TV in this way that we often will do when we're watching like a football game or, you know, some series that we're wanting to watch together or something. So there was something kind of cool about how TV played a sort of a part, I guess, in this retelling.
Yeah. No, I appreciated that. I mean, there were so many things that I appreciated, and I want to speak to the idea that both it's valuable to look at myths and try to understand them in the context in which they were told, you know, what they tell us about the people of that time and the way they saw the world and their role within culture and within the greater cosmos. That's really valuable. And I think that for these myths to stay alive, these retellings which occur throughout time are also really important, right? Like I am curious, you know, how many people will watch a show like Kaos and then get curious about the Greek gods and want to learn more about them. But I do, and I see that a lot within Hindu mythology as well, these modern retellings of these very old stories that actually keep it alive now. So I think both are valuable. And even though sometimes it can be, as you said, like it's really interesting to see, as you said, these characters come alive in someone else's imagination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what I'm doing, you know, right now with the series of books that I'm writing on divine feminine figures from around the world. I'm retelling the story, you know, from a feminist lens, also from a lens of looking at how these goddesses and other figures actually relate to each other or evolved from each other in some cases, because so much of the story that's being told is, you know, colonization or, you know, big changes in that group of people and how the myths changed in accordance with how the people's values changed and so on. And I wanted to do the retellings because the story is the meat of it, right? You want to hear the story. It's got this sort of bedtime story quality to it. And a lot of these myths exist in sort of anthologies of Greek myth where the story is really minimal and then there's all this extrapolation about what it meant and so on. And I'm also doing some context in each chapter so that we can understand the historical context, where it comes from, who is telling these stories, why were they telling these stories, what was important about that, but then also how we can apply it to our current day. I mean, you and I have also a lot of intimacy with Hindu myths and tantric myths. We both studied that from sort of a yoga perspective. And I feel like so many of those goddesses in particular taught me things I couldn't have learned from Christian culture, from the Christian culture that I grew up in. There were just these other ways of looking at the world, these other perspectives that the goddesses kind of gave me a window into. And I feel like that was so valuable coming from a place where, like, I can go on and on about this, but, you know, for a lot of people who grew up in the Christian faith or the sort of like post-Christian atheistic white settler perspective, a lot of your spirituality has been sucked out of you because of the Christian colonial project. And so I think there are a lot of people, maybe like you and me, who are white settlers, you know, on this land, who are like thirsty for myth and spirituality and story and deeper meanings and so on that we're kind of missing in what we were given in this culture.
Absolutely. And also, as you said, like these different faces, these different archetypal faces of the divine and therefore like of aspects of ourselves. And I think that's what's really missing for a lot of people is this, in particular, with the goddess figures, right? For women to have these like other faces of the divine or of our own nature that we just don't see reflected in our dominant culture. So I agree. For me, it's been really enriching. And then, of course, to then look deeper into the roots of pre-Christian European cultures and see, oh, all those goddesses are there too. They're all there too, right? I mean, there's a lot of really fascinating goddess figures in the ancient Greek stories. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of these characters. Like, what did you think of Persephone in Chaos?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it was your story about Persephone that kind of clued me into this older story. And for those of you that don't know, which is probably most people, I feel like you have to kind of research this to know it. The Greek myths that we're familiar with are patriarchalized Greek myths. There was a time when those societies were likely matriarchal and the goddesses were worshipped alone. So Demeter, Persephone, Hera, Artemis, I think, Pandora. There were a bunch of specifically goddesses that, they had their own realms, they did their own thing. They just didn't there weren't really gods around. Like, they just didn't really do that. And so what happened was that the northern invaders, who were the Zeus followers, came in and invaded these lands where the goddesses were worshipped, and then those cultures essentially syncretized. And what's so interesting about that is that Hera specifically I find so interesting, and we can talk about her in Chaos. She's the bitch, right? That's how we know her, is she's jealous. In Chaos, she turned Dionysus's mother into a bee, and anyone she doesn't like, she just turns into a bee and then eats honey every morning for breakfast. And in Chaos, they show her as this queen who placates the king in order to get what she needs and kind of does her own thing in her own way. And she does quite a bit of a yes dear sort of thing with Zeus in order to create her own means. So I think we know her as this sort of bitter, jealous wife who's always turning human women into animals after Zeus has essentially raped them, like it's not their fault. But when we can look at Hera from this perspective of she was the queen, she was the only queen, and then these Zeus people came in and said, now you're going to be married to this guy and he's the king now, it kind of makes a bit more sense why she has this bitter quality. So I thought she was interesting. I think one piece about the casting that was interesting, and I feel like this story has a British influence, and British TV, I find, looks a little bit different than American TV, and it's a little darker than American TV. We were just talking before we started recording about how we're both devastated that it's already been decided that this series is not renewing, even though it only came out in August. Like, we've barely had any time to let anybody watch the show. Wow. There are already a group of devoted fans, and there are some people who didn't really like it that much. And I'm kind of wondering if part of that is, the British, it's often a bit darker. I thought it was interesting that the Olympians were older actors, because we often think of the Olympian gods as sort of youthful and perfect forever. And we've got Jeff Goldblum and the actor who plays Hera and Poseidon, like they're all a bit older, which is interesting to see because we just don't get to see that often. And I'm wondering how many American viewers were just like, I don't like that, and just were turned off by it too quickly for that.
I didn't think of that, but I was fascinated by that choice because, that's part of the mythology that the gods, of course, drink this ambrosia, the meander water in Chaos, that keeps them young and youthful forever, that they don't age, that there are no aging gods. And I thought that was so fascinating that they showed them in these kind of like middle age, moving towards their elder years. It was, I would love to sit down with the writer and just pick their brain.
Why make the choice that way? And there was that scene too where Zeus, who's Jeff Goldblum, finds a wrinkle. Mm-hmm. And the prophecy is a line appears, the order wanes, the family falls, and chaos reigns. Thank you. So so Zeus thinks it's a vertical wrinkle on his forehead, and you're looking at him look at this vertical wrinkle amongst all the other wrinkles that this actor has on his face, and you're just like, that's a bit funny. Like, it would kind of make more sense if it was this very youthful person who had a single wrinkle. Like, that would be a little disturbing to see. So maybe part of it was as I'm thinking about it now, a big theme in Chaos is about how these gods have held power for so long, and it's time for that to change, right? Like, the people are not trusting the gods the way that they used to. The gods are not reigning very well, right? Especially Zeus, he's just like, oh, they're not paying enough attention to me. I need to make another natural disaster so that they remember to fear me. And I think it's actually Ari and King Minos when he's talking about executing the Trojans who desecrated the statue to the gods. She's saying if we give them leniency and compassion, they'll be on our side. Whereas if we just kill their people, it's going to be enemies forever. And that's kind of what Zeus is doing as well.
Yes.
So Prometheus, who's a major character in this story, is trying to fulfill this prophecy that it's time for this order to wane, right? And so maybe they're all older because they're waning a little and they don't notice, right? Like they're not aware that they are aging out. Like it's time for maybe the younger generation to take over.
That's what I thought. That's how they were showing it. Like they've really, they've past their prime. They've been there, not like to diminish people in their middle years, which is where I am. But, I kind of liked that. Like, oh, this is what it would be like if the gods were still here. Like they do, even the gods age. But I do like that frame that you just said. Yeah, that they're waning, that they are past their prime, and that way of ruling, which is like might is right, is expiring. It needs to expire. And it kind of shows, again, modern day Crete, as they're showing, which is the main place on Earth that we see. There's a lot of discord. There's a lot of unhappiness. There's a lot of inequity. And so something has to shift.
Absolutely. And I think for me, at the end, when you see Ari shaking hands with the ruler of Troy, and they're agreeing to basically rule against the gods and like for the people. And there's something really amazing. We'll talk more about Ariadne's story, I'm sure, but to see this woman who's really having these experiences of seeing how the people are suffering and how what the gods are doing is not working and how she was lied to, and her really coming into power in this interesting way. I think there's something really satisfying about seeing like, ooh, what is the world look like when Ari's in power? That's very different from King Minos, who's coming from this very traditional, do anything Poseidon tells me to do, including if that's to kill people, including my own child, right? So that was one piece where I was just like, oh my God, give me the season 2. I want to see what Ari does.
Yeah, and I love that they brought in the Trojans, right? And then that sense at the end there, of like allying with these people who were then marginalized within this society where the Olympian gods rule. Because, that's such a terrible story too, the way the Trojans were treated by the ancient Greeks, in that great myth of Greek culture. But I was so excited to see how the writer again would portray their story, the Trojans, if we got to see more of that, because they were these figures that were there throughout the series, but we didn't really ever get to feature one, like really put the focus on one and get to know what they would say.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's so resonant with, Israel and Palestine and Russia and Ukraine and some of these conflicts that are happening right now where somebody thinks they have the right to take over a people and, that people is finding ways to rebel. And so, I loved it. I loved the concept of Troy Town, which felt very Romeo and Juliet again. This kind of wild place where people are just trying to survive. I thought a little of the Downton East Side, actually, when that came up. And then there are these rebels from Troy Town who don't care if they live or die. They want to free their people, right? And so they're sort of working to do that, while there's also this larger story, I think, of prophecy and free will and the gods' will. And there is a sense that nobody's free in this. Like they all just have to kind of follow along with what the gods say, which is really powerful. So that's one of the big themes of the series, I think, is free will, freedom, who's in control, who's in power, what does that mean?
Yeah, and who has the story, who has the truth, who has the
truth, yeah.
Right? This idea of, this great obscuration of truth that the gods are pulling over the human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so, one of the themes around prophecy that I thought was so interesting was this idea that everybody gets a prophecy when they're born, and they're all quite vague. I think it's difficult to interpret what the prophecies mean. So Riddy, for example, thinks that she's fulfilled her prophecy already, and so does Canaeus, I think. But then it turns out their prophecy was something larger than that. And watching Zeus, who has his own prophecy, that's the same as Canaeus and Riddy's prophecy, sort of struggle against that. And the irony of, in trying so hard to prevent his prophecy from coming true, he orchestrates it, essentially. And that's the same thing with Ari and King Minos, where, you know, King Minos tries so hard to prevent this thing from happening that ends up happening in this very Greek, tragic, bloody death, you know, kind of way, where the truth is revealed. And, you know, there's also that sort of Oedipal sense of like who's who within the family. And it turns out this was always, you know, the Minotaur was always your son, and you had him hidden away there, and now you're going to try to kill him. But it turns out Ari was the one that was going to kill King Minos all the time. Yeah. And if he didn't know that prophecy and just raised his twins lovingly, that never would have happened, right? And, you know, I don't know if you feel this sometimes, but as a tarot reader, sometimes people want to come in knowing specifically, is everything going to be okay? That's the question that people come in with. And I am so careful to not tell the future with tarot, because I think knowing the future is incredibly disempowering. Whereas if you can know these are the energies that are at play, here's a piece of yourself that's influencing your question, you know, it looks like if the cards want you to go in this direction, there's always choice, right? And I've had experiences before where the cards have given a little bit of divination, and because they gave some useful warnings and so on, it changed the course of that person's, you know, trajectory. And so, you know, there's something so dangerous about prophecy, about knowing the future. Like, it's not, there's a reason we don't know the future. There's a reason we shouldn't know the future. Because of free will, we have to be able to make choices as we go. And being aware of these things is really helpful. But then what we do with it is ultimately what's most important. And I think in this show, we see so many people just falling into the trap of, you know, trying to prevent a prophecy and then making it come true anyway. And there's that moment where the fates are trying to explain to Zeus, like, it's real if you believe in it. Like, you're the one that's going to have to make it come true. And they're kind of like, we know you want to kill us. So they douse themselves with gasoline and they're like, go right ahead. Like, we know you're going to do this. And they're sort of warning him at the time, like, you know, this isn't going to work, right? And Zeus is just like, I got to do it. I got to do it. Like, he's so caught in his sense of like, this must be the right thing. And of course, it turns out to be exactly the wrong thing for him.
But I love that because they also allow him to enact his free will, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And what I love is that how the writer worked with this thing, which was something that I think the ancient Greeks wrestled with in their own way, right? Like prophecy and these oracles were a very big part of ancient Greek culture. And in many cases, like especially with the one at Delphi, that prophecy or oracle was used often to help determine really important matters of state. And at the same time, their myths are full of these stories that, you know, like the story of Oedipus, and also with the Trojan king Priam as well. There was like the prophecy about his children, Paris and Cassandra, and he tried to subvert that, but it didn't work, right? And he lost his city and he lost everything. And so it's obviously they were reckoning with that. Like, is it of value to know the future? Can we escape our fate anyway? You know, will we always, in our own enactment of our free will, find our way to the place where we're meant to be anyway? So I really appreciated the way the writer brought all of that in, because it's very true to, I think, these big themes that the ancient Greek culture was working with or wrestling with or questioning.
You know, it's interesting because I was doing some research on Morgan Le Fay for this book and the Arthurian legends and stuff, and I was listening to some podcasts about the history of that time in England and what was happening in the culture and so on. And, you know, there were quite a few English kings who had astrologers or seers kind of on their council. And some of these kings had myths created around them. And like Arthur is a myth of English might, essentially. Like Arthur was probably not really a real person. He's sort of a fantasy of what people wanted a king to mean at a time when there was a lot of turmoil in Britain and the kings didn't tend to last very long and so on. And there was one king, I can't remember which one, but he was so invested in his own myth of like, I'm meant to be the great ruler and I'm this magical person and so on, that he kind of went off the deep end with it. And that's what created the distrust of the people that caused him to be ousted, because he sort of forgot the practical aspects of, like, you also have to do the thing where you rule, though. Like, you can't just be in this story of you being this amazing king without actually doing king things. And so that's kind of what caused his downfall, which I thought was really interesting.
And all, it's just like that idea, which I think, where we confuse, like today we'd call like celebrity culture, people believing their own sort of celebrity archetype and losing their self, and when this becomes our rulers, our politicians, it's really terrifying. But it's an old story, isn't it? Right? The gods, or the kings, believing that they were the gods and forgetting their humanity.
A very old story. Yeah, in many cultures. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Orpheus, let's talk about Orpheus for a minute. So Orpheus and Eurydice is a big story. I feel like that's one that a lot of people go back to again and again. The story of Orpheus, who was, I can't remember if he was a god or sort of a demigod of music.
Well, he was considered the first poet, right? And he is a figure. He was a figure who became a kind of god. He was considered to be the son of one of the muses, the 9 muses. And then later he becomes, there's many things we can say about it, demigod, I would say, probably within
sort of a lesser god, but still sort of higher than a regular human. Exactly. Yeah. And I think in the story, Eurydice is bitten by a snake, and he goes to the underworld to retrieve her. And there's just that tragic moment of, like, his only rule is don't look back. And he can't help himself, and he looks back on their way back to Earth, and she returns to the underworld. And, I think there's a lot in that story about the deep desire that many of us have to retrieve someone from the underworld. I think that's very relatable. A lot of us, when someone has died, we want to bring them back. We want to make that not the case. And I think in so many, even mythological stories, magical stories, there's often a motif of, like, don't bring people back from the dead. Mm-hmm. Like, that is one place that even mythology often won't go, because there's something sacred about the finality of death and the fact that we really don't know what happens after we die. And that's a mystery that has to kind of remain a mystery in a lot of ways. Though there are people who will tell you, of course, near-death experiences and so on. Maybe some people do have a window into that, but ultimately it is such a mystery. And even if someone has a near-death experience and does come back, it's not because somebody controlled that, right? I mean, like, the medical interventions may have worked or they didn't, but I think there are so many stories about someone praying, or casting a spell or something like that. And often if this person does come back, they're a zombie now, or they're evil now, or even in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, there's a story about her dying, being buried, and then they bring her back, and they think she's going to be so happy that they brought her back. And she was just like, guys, I was in peace. Like, what are you doing? You made me come back here? Mm-hmm. She really struggles with having returned to life. Yeah. So, I think this story is really resonant in a lot of ways. And I thought it was interesting that the series, first of all, Orpheus wasn't quite what I expected him to look like from that fan fiction perspective. He was someone on this podcast I was listening to referred to him as a Chris Martin, like Coldplay sort of version of a musician hero. And I personally am not a fan of Coldplay, but it's the sort of thing where a lot of people are fans. And there's a lot of moments where it's like, oh, I went with my mom to that concert. Like, my mom loves Orpheus. It's this sort of, like, he's cool with a lot of people, but he's also very mainstream, maybe. And in the story, Eurydice doesn't want to be with him anymore. And I think a lot of that is that he loves her because she's his muse and he needs her for her music. But he doesn't have a great grasp on how she actually feels, what she actually wants, what she actually would like the relationship to look like, how uncomfortable she is with being this public muse for him, because that's just not who she really wants to be. And so the story, they really change the story in a lot of ways. Eurydice has all kinds of experiences in the underworld. She falls in love with Canaeus. She doesn't want to return, And ultimately she does, but they break up at the end, right? She's like, I'm not doing this with you anymore. Like, you're going to have to go start again, and so on. So, yeah, I would love to know your thoughts on that retelling.
Well, I love, because I was so curious how they were going to do that. Like, is she going to be able to leave the underworld? And so that, because in the original telling, or, the primary telling that we have, he does go down and he charms, in particular, Persephone with his music. And she allows Eurydice to travel back with that one caveat, don't look back. And when, again, spoiler alert, when Orpheus does make it to the underworld in Chaos, Hades is like, good job. That's awesome. But yeah, no one goes back. This is not how this works. And I was like, what are they going to do here? And then, Persephone like puts Hades to bed and is like, hey, come on, hurry up, get out of here. Like and he's like, why are you doing this? Because I can, and because I like your music. She'd gone to the concert with her mom. I love that. But then, so I was like, but is Eurydice actually going to be able to make it out? And she does. But that was, to me, that was that way of saying, but he doesn't get her back. Right?
He doesn't get her back.
Doesn't get her back. She doesn't even get in the car with him to drive home. She doesn't even take the ride home with him. It's like, you got her out, but she's not with you. It's beautiful. And, it's meant to, like, I think that story, I remember the first time I heard that story, it gets you. It gets you in a deep place, right? And that idea that who doesn't get touched by this love that is so great that a lover will travel to the underworld, a place where we cannot go, and charm the gods in order to get their beloved back, right? So it's like, I think many people think we want to love Orpheus for that. And I was a little bit, I will say, it was one of the characters I had the hardest time with. Just the way he was portrayed. Not because he was a likable enough character in the story, but as, the character of Orpheus and all that Orpheus actually represents, like the wildness of Orpheus and his relationship to the Orphic mysteries and all of that. It was hard to see Orpheus as just sort of this guy that's, sort of clued out in his connection to his wife. And I will say, I wish that story had been also fleshed out a little more in Chaos. So we got to know more. What is it? More, like you said, I think that Eurydice didn't really love being this public facing muse, with her face on billboards, because she's not that kind of character. It's very obvious. But we just saw this guy who seemed so sweet and loving and adoring. And we didn't really get, I feel like, enough of an understanding of why she was so unhappy. And I would have liked to see more of, what it felt like for her. That was it was done in a very concise way. But that was very much the story that we got, that their love was however he conceived of it, it was not how she was experiencing it.
There may have been a bit of a push, from Netflix to be like, go hard, go fast, like get all of the images, and all the cool stuff out as quickly as you can. Mm-hmm. Another great line from this podcast I was listening to, it's the ADHD of Greek mythology. And so, it did take me a few episodes. I was always going to watch it because I was so curious about the retelling of the Greek mythology, and I already love that so much. But I will say the first few episodes, the violence was really extreme. Mm-hmm. That's not something I'm a super fan of in general, though I do understand that Greek mythology is honestly very bloody, very violent. Like, that is resonant with Greek tragedy.
Yes, it is.
But it was really when Eurydice got to the underworld and met Canaeus, that's when I started to get really invested in this show, because Canaeus was the most human of the characters, I thought, and Eurydice was too, but it's like that's when you really started to care about the relationships between these people. Ironically, after they had died, they're in the underworld. But Canaeus is a story I didn't know too much about, but Canaeus apparently was a princess who had sex with Poseidon. I don't know if that was coerced or not, but in some versions of that telling, asked Poseidon to make her into a boy because she wanted to be a boy who didn't have to have children and all these things. And so, like, it was a blessing from Poseidon to Canis, is the princess's name, to become Canaeus, the male character, who becomes like a great warrior, I think, like an invulnerable man in the myth. And so in Chaos, we have Canaeus as the originally daughter of an Amazon, and the Amazons are TERFs in Chaos. They're very feminist, woman power, but trans is not okay, right? You know, boys have to leave at a certain point, they can never come back, and girls have to stay girls or else it's like defying the gods. And so, you know, there's such tender moments of Canaeus and his mother having this conversation, and his mother really understanding, like, I see that you're a boy, I see that you've always been that, like, this is who you really are, and I want to help you do this, even though it's going to get you exiled, like, you could be in mortal danger, but I still want to help you do that. And it was really lovely to see, you know, the mother's interaction. And at first we don't really know what the mother's relationship is. Like, did she betray Canaeus? Like, how did this go? And Canaeus is kind of waiting for her to arrive in the underworld so that he can figure out, like, what was that, you know, what happened and all that. And she actually has a really important part to play in the prophecy at the very end. But it was so tender to see, like, Eurydice and Canaeus falling in love in this really sweet way. Canaeus is just this really authentic person who, like, loves the dog. You know, that the Cerberus, the three-headed little, super cute little, you know, whatever type of dog that was, that's kind of like a TSA, you know, drug sniffing dog in Asphodel, and to see the relationship with the mom, I just thought that was so beautiful. I think that was my favorite part of the whole show, and it came later, right?
I was so touched on so many levels, and so, yeah, delighted by because the original, like, from Ovid's Metamorphosis, the story of Canaeus is pretty gnarly story, right? Because she is this beautiful woman who's raped in the original story by Poseidon, absolutely against her will, but because he's taken this thing from her and enjoyed it, he gives her a boon, and her boon is that make me a man so I never have to experience this, like what it is to be overpowered,
Oof.
to be violated. Yeah.
Wow.
And also he gives her the gift of not only being a man, but having this impenetrable skin. Like,
Wow.
she can't be penetrated.
Whew,
Right, yeah, right?
that layer, I didn't know that layer, and that
Yeah,
is hitting
yeah.
hard.
And,
Wow.
as someone who is the mother of a trans person, like, these parts that were in the story were really moving, and I really appreciated, and, the writer being a non-binary trans person as well, and really bringing this in, but retelling it in a way that is not so horrifying, because I think for any trans person, or someone who loves a trans person, to read the original story is really difficult, because Canaeus then becomes this great warrior and then has this really ferocious battle with the centaurs, who are quite wild characters. And there is a character, a centaur, who at one point berates Canaeus, and it could be someone today saying just the most vile things to a trans person, right? Like that. If you read those lines out, it's the same thing that someone
Wow.
says. Like, just he's basically speaking against Canaeus, for being this person who kind of has violated their sex, and as it were, and they can't kill him. They can't kill him in the way that is normal. So they crush him to death. They can't pierce his skin with swords, and so they basically tear down all these trees and cover him with the weight of these trees until the life is crushed out of him. It's a terrible story. The one beautiful thing is, one of the ideas is that when Canaeus's soul escapes his body, it's this beautiful bird that flies free. So I love that. First of all, that Canaeus' story is kind of retold. And again, I'm so sad that there isn't going to be a second series, because I want to see the kind of like warrior that Canaeus becomes in bringing the dead back to life, bringing their souls back, which is part of what happens right at the very end. And lastly, I love that they brought in the Amazons, and again, showing these kind of marginalized characters, because it really showed that the Amazons were living in an area that's really inhospitable. And Canaeus even said nothing could grow where we lived as a child. And that's something Canaeus later in their life really enjoyed, was being able to grow things, but kind of referred to this idea that they lived in a wasteland, which is what was true for the Amazons, kind of marginalized characters. But yeah, I found that really fascinating, that then, they portray these kind of like, really tough women, this culture of women only, but then, yeah, they're TERFs. Like, I deeply appreciated the way the writer worked all of these themes into the story. working with.
Wow, I didn't know a lot of that context. And I didn't realize, is it Charlie Covell who's
Yeah.
non-binary?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing I did really love also about Canaeus' story is that, I feel like when we do get a trans story, there's often a lot of violence, there's a lot of devastation, there's a lot of tragedy. It's trans characters don't have it super easy in most of the movies and TV shows and stuff that we have access to. And so here's this story where Canaeus has this past that was difficult. And now that I think of it, actually, I think Canaeus was pierced by a sword or an arrow or something by the Amazon when they go and kill him. So just that penetrability is, I didn't know any of that. That's so amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, horrible, and also like really resonant, but that, Canaeus has this sort of relatively peaceful underworld life and falls in love with Eurydice and then ends up becoming this incredibly powerful character who can actually do something that Hades can't do. Right? Because Hades witnesses Canaeus coming back to life and renewing his mom's soul in the nothing. And Hades says, you can renew souls. Because he just tried to do it with Astyanax. He tries to put his soul back in and Hades can't do it. And then he sees Canaeus doing something that the god can't do. And so, here's a story about a trans character who is loved, who has consensual, healthy sex with someone who cares about him, and who reunites with his mother who loved him all along, and then becomes sort of special, having some sort of superpower that's bigger than the gods. And again, like, give me more Canaeus. Like, I want to watch the season 2. And I know Charlie Covell has 2 more seasons that are kind of mapped out in their brain, because I read something about there is more to the story here. Like, it wasn't meant to end at this season 1. And Canaeus is the character I'd be coming back for more, for sure.
Yeah. So that was just, I really deeply appreciated the way exactly that character was, and that it's a trans character, that trans actor that plays the character as well. I think is also worth mentioning, because sometimes that's not the case. And
yeah, absolutely. Important. Again, bringing in the Amazons as TERFs is so interesting because they are usually used as a feminist icon, right? This idea that Amazons were this group of warrior women and they didn't allow men in and everything. Like, there are some women that really, including me, I would say, like, that sort of resonate with the idea of women can be warriors, women can be powerful, like they can do it in a community on their own. Like, all of that is really powerful. And the reality is that there are feminists who do not accept trans people as worthy of the same kind of fight and rights that they're trying to give for themselves. J.K. Rowling comes to mind, who's, also her own kind of mythologist in a way with Harry Potter, I guess. But it's, that to me, like, the whole J.K. Rowling thing feels like such a betrayal, because when I originally read those Harry Potter books, there was a lot of stuff about equality and, being different and it being okay to be different. And then it turns out that this author is highly feminist and terrified of trans people and just thinks that they're evil, wants to stomp them into the ground in that way, right?
And this is
like in Canaeus' story,
right? And it's deeply confusing for many of us that this exists, right? That there are these figures in our life. I think of many feminists and spiritual teachers that are like radical eco-feminists and things like that I've looked up to at times, and then to also know that they hold these ideas against often trans women in particular. And that's just, it's deeply confusing. And I so appreciate that the writer brought that in, that that's also part of this landscape that we're dealing with, that we're living within.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also thought there was a moment that I found quite moving, which relates to, I guess, the belief theme and how belief is related to power, where we watch Ari and Theseus go to the mortal games. I forget what they call it, but people fight to the death, which was also kind of a Greek, there would be these gladiators. Yeah. And, these sort of public spectacles of people battling animals or each other to the death, and that being like a fun thing to do on a Saturday, which is kind of wild. And of course, today we have our sports games, and we have our spectacles that we like to watch, where there's some thrill and excitement when someone gets injured or a fight breaks out or whatever it is. So we actually still have that energy even today, though it's not to the death anymore. But anyway, they watch this Amazon and another warrior fight each other, and they both end up dying, which is great. Like at the crowd roars, but then they recur in the underworld. And there's this moment where they're so gleefully running to the frame to have their lives be renewed. And they have this belief that, well, I did what I believed was right in my life, so I'm going to have a great new life. Like, let's get back into it and we'll go back and we'll fight each other to the death again. And they just can't wait to do it again. And then you see them go through the frame and then that's it. It turns out that there is no renewal. The big spoiler of the show is that the gods have been harvesting human souls rather than renewing them as they used to do. And this is Zeus's whole scheme for remaining immortal and so on. And it's disrupting the balance of the universe for him to do that. But I think that moment was quite touching because there are a lot of people in this show, including the woman who is the consensual human sacrifice on the is this festival of the...
Yeah, it's like some festival to the gods. And
I feel like Heraklion festival or Olympiad festival or something like that.
Yeah.
So, she so gleefully sacrifices herself, and then Riddy meets her on the ferry to Asphodel, and she's just so self-righteous, and Riddy is like, I don't know, I defied the gods, like I'm probably going to come back as a stone or something, and she's just like, well, that was poor choices on your part. Like she has a very she really looks down on Riddy for not being this sort of religious person. And it turns out that all these people were living their entire lives under false pretenses, and I think that's very resonant for today too, because there are many people who devote their lives to some version of religion or spirituality in some way that includes things like, you're not supposed to have sex, you're not supposed to drink, you're not supposed to enjoy certain pleasures of the body, you can't be trans, you can't be gay, like there are you have to deny like a reality of your identity in order to get into heaven or in order to be a good person or whatever it is. And so, that moment of like, then you die, you meet God or you go to heaven or you don't, whatever it is. And it turns out none of that was real. And you could have had an entire life enjoying what it is to be in a body instead of denying what it is to be in a body. And so there was something for me that like almost brought tears to my eyes to see these warriors so gleefully expecting this. And then, if they never really know because their souls are taken and they're just not conscious of it. But if they were to find that out, they would discover like, oh, I probably shouldn't have killed myself at like age 20. I could have lived a whole, like if that was the only life I had, I would have treated it really differently. So how many of us, are in that belief system? And if we really do think like, okay, this is my only shot, like this is what I've got, how would we treat our bodies differently? How would we treat each other differently? How would we, understand these powers that be differently? So, I think a big one is how belief controls people in chaos. And that's something that definitely still happens.
And I love, because again, that theme is something that we see in the Greek myths. Like it's one of my favorite moments. There's so many moments within Homer's Odyssey that I love, but it's one that I can find particularly poignant is when Odysseus is in the underworld and he meets with the shade of Achilles, right? Because the Greek underworld was conceived of this place where it's just gray and it's a nothing kind of place and you have no agency. There's no aliveness. That's why it's portrayed as like with no color, and that there's no taste, there's no flavor, there's no joy. You can't enact there's nothing you can do, there's no agency there. And so he comes upon the shade of Achilles, right? He's fed the ghosts some blood so they're enlivened for a period of time and he can engage with them. And this moment when Achilles comes and Odysseus is like kind of telling him, hey, you're this great like hero, there's so many songs about you now. And he says, I would do anything to have life back. Like I would rather be the slave of a poor man in the mortal realm and like feel the sun on my skin than be the king of the underworld. And it's just this moment because it's speaking so in that story again to these great beliefs that ran that culture. The ancient Greek culture had such a focus on this idea of kleos, of fame, right? The idea was that Achilles was kind of given this choice. Like, do you want a short life of glory where your name will be remembered forever, or a long life where nobody knows your name? And there he is in the underworld. He's like, I wish I'd chosen the long life where nobody knew my name. I'd rather be the slave of a poor person and be alive. But that I ran my life on this belief that our culture is built on. And I regret my choice now that I know the full story. And so even there, again, that this idea is being wrestled with within that culture. What is the belief, whether it's like a religious belief or again, some kind of cultural project that dogma, ideology that we put so much stock in and then are not actually experiencing who we really are or what our life could be. It's moving.
Very moving. Absolutely. And I feel like the more that you're sharing, you know, these specific details from the metamorphosis and so on, the closer I feel Chaos is actually to a lot of these mythologies in terms of its themes and certain very poignant moments coming sort of directly from the poetry of Ovid and so on.
Yeah. That's why I say it would be so great to sit down with the writer and be like, okay, like
Yeah.
how much is hidden in there? I know they spoke about this idea of like Easter eggs, like I know they wanted it to be accessible that if you didn't know the myths, you'd still get the gist. But for people
Right.
who knew it, they would see it. And I do think for anyone who hasn't watched it, listening to this, like watch it, but then watch it again. Like I watched it twice, even though I agree, Julie, at first the violence was hard for me and the darkness of it, because I don't do well with a lot of I don't watch violent shows, but it is true to Greek myth. But stick with it and even watch it a couple times, because it is, like you said, there's so much happens so fast. There's so much imagery and the story moves so quickly. You can't take it in all at once. There's actually a lot layered in there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about Persephone because, yeah, that's something that you and I both have maybe different intimacies with. But what did you think about, her portrayal, her casting, Hades' casting, the relationship with each other, that moment at the end where she says, why the story? Why did you tell everybody the story that I'm in the underworld against my will? I actually want to be there.
I love that. So yeah, there's this scene I love. She's sitting at the table with Hera and the other gods, and she's eating a sandwich. She's just like, why'd you tell that story? Why'd you make the world think that I didn't love Hades? And I just loved that because yes, I love, first of all, one of the things I think is valuable about myth is that we can look at it from many different angles. That's both good and dangerous about myths, because it can be retold in a way that can support, certain ideologies and things like that. But we can look at it from many different angles. And many of us grew up with the story of the rape of Persephone, which can be looked at, as this idea of these sort of patriarchal, sky gods coming and creating a kind of dominance over the older, maybe closer to the earth, feminine religions and cultures. That's certainly a valuable way of looking at that myth. And it's a difficult one if we look at it that way, right? And I know that I shared with you that really lovely little volume by Charlene Spretnak, the idea of the sort of looking at the older stories of it, and this idea that Persephone wasn't abducted or raped, but was called to the underworld, that she had her own draw to be there. And that really sparked, a curiosity in me. And I, also loved that idea that she actually loved him, that she found in him, in the end, a consort that she chose. Because give me a break that she didn't know what would happen if you ate something in the underworld. Of course she knew
Right.
that if you ate something in the underworld, it would be there. And so why did she make that choice in the end after saying no to taking anything from him? So I love that the writer brought that in, that Persephone...
She's allergic to pomegranates in Chaos.
Pomegranates. And why I love it. Pomegranates. Like I love it. Allergic to them. So I love that she said that there's actually love there, that she's there by choice. I thought it was fascinating that they chose a Black woman, for like the queen of the underworld. That's really powerful. And again, I wanted to hear more of their story and also how they were going to weave that in, because in the story, in Chaos, they made it very clear that she was not part of the family, right? She did not get the manna. She was not part of the family. Whereas in the Greek pantheon, she is part of the family. She's the daughter of Demeter, and I believe also the daughter of Zeus. Is she not? Like Persephone is the... Or is it Zeus or Poseidon? Like either way.
No, I think Zeus rapes Demeter.
Exactly.
And
Persephone is the child of the rape, incestual rape, and so she's very much of the family, but in this retelling of Chaos, she's not. And I was really curious to hear more about Persephone's story and her mom and all of that. So in general, I would say I loved the character of Persephone, and I appreciated that was woven in. Hades was an interesting character. I would have liked. I thought he was showing his strength at the end, how he was going to defy Zeus. But again, I feel we only got a fragment of the story, and I'd like to hear more. Yeah, what did you think? What did you think?
Yeah, and if that story is wrong, how did she meet Hades? What family is she a part of? Like, what is the background to how they got together? And also, again, with that casting, Persephone is, she doesn't seem maiden young like a teen, because in the story she's the Kore, the maiden character. But she actually, Hades seems very obviously middle-aged. Like, he's got the glasses and he's bald and he looks like not so great, I guess. But Persephone remains more in her prime, I think, is like maybe in her 30s or something, I guess. But yeah, I appreciated in your version of the story that you graciously shared with me, this idea that Hades abducted Persephone because that's all that had been modeled for him, right? There's the way Zeus is with women and the way that, Poseidon is or whatever, they just take whatever they want. And so in your version of the story, there was this possibility that Hades was really falling in love with her and wanted to have a chance to get to know her. And the only way that he had seen was like, oh, you just steal people that you want to get to know. And that in your version of the story, they get to the underworld and he's like really quite sorry about that. And he kind of gives her a lot of space and he's like, you can have your own chambers. Like, I would love to get to know you, but I'm so sorry I scared you. Like in your story, he sees how scared she is by being abducted. And that's what kind of makes him realize, like, that's not what I wanted for you. I actually wanted a chance to kind of get to know you. And then they slowly have this experience in the underworld that, as you say, Persephone has been called to this underworld position and she loves it there. And she, is getting to know Hades and kind of falling in love with Hades. So that was just a very different way of kind of looking at, I think, also masculine patriarchal modeling that, again, we still have in this culture. It's different, but we do still have some problematic ways that people think about dating and courting and getting to know each other and initiating sex and consent and things like that. And so I liked that concept that someone could have something modeled for them and then have a human reaction to that and noticing like, oh, actually, that didn't feel very good in my body. And I would love to know from you what that felt like for you and how do we work through that? Like, that was a very sweet way, I think, of exploring the concept of the rape of Persephone, right? I actually have two versions of the Persephone story because I'm writing about Persephone in the first of this series, and then I actually go back to Hecate, who has a role in that story as well in the second in the series. One of the things I found so interesting when I was researching was that many goddesses, not only Greek goddesses, but from other cultures as well, in pre-patriarchal times, goddesses were usually both light and dark. They presided over war and fertility. They were a part of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And so the goddesses didn't need to be purely good or purely bad, often because they were often land-based nature goddesses. A goddess of the sea or of the forest could bring gifts, but she could also bring, storms or tsunamis or whatever it is. And so there was this understanding that if this deity represents nature, nature has both light and dark qualities, and that's a part of the deity of it all, like those parts that we can't control. And so there are a lot of stories in which a goddess holds both, and then after the patriarchal shifts, she's broken into two goddesses. So Demeter was known as Demeter Chthoniya, I don't really know how to pronounce that well, but Demeter of the underworld, and dead people were called the Demetrioi, because the idea was that for Demeter, who was the goddess of grain, to pull up grain from the earth, she had to get it from the underworld. Like, that's where the seeds had to come from, right? And so Demeter was an underworld goddess as well as a grain goddess. And so there is a theory that Persephone is actually holding the underworld aspect of Demeter for her, but they had to split these goddesses into two pieces and say that Persephone was there against her will because it doesn't fit the patriarchal light, dark, God, human, the sort of binary perspective of the more patriarchal cultures that came in, that those goddesses had to be separated. It also may have happened with Artemis and Hecate. So Hecate, in some versions of the Persephone story, she helps Demeter find Persephone. She heard a big crash going into the underworld, so she's aware that something happened. Hecate has the keys to the underworld, so she can come and go as she likes. And in some versions of the story, she stays with Persephone in the underworld as kind of like an aunt character or a mentor character to sort of help her through what she's going through. And so in my version where I'm a little more focused on Hecate, the pomegranate is Hecate's spell. Like, let me help you guys. I know that you want to have the option to come and go. If you eat a few pomegranate seeds, that will give you the key, because Hecate is all about the keys, right? It's like, it'll give you the key to be able to come and go from the underworld seasonally so that you can have half the year with your mom and you can have half the year in the underworld. And that's kind of a compromise to the problem, which is, again, an example of a goddess in this case who they say was once an aspect of Artemis that had to be pulled out so that Artemis could be this kind of more light character and Hecate could be her darker aspect. You know, it's these feminine characters who have power, but there's limits to their power, right? And they can't always defy the gods. The male gods tend to have more power than the goddesses in many ways in the post-patriarchal versions of the story.
I love that. I've not heard that idea of Artemis, the wild goddess of the hunt, and Hecate being conjoined. That's fascinating. I can't wait to read your books. And yeah, just for me to even just contemplate that for a while. I love that. That idea that, you know, Demeter and Persephone, of course, being at the heart of like the Eleusinian mysteries, which were these great mystery rites around rebirth, right? And going at that, of course, it makes sense that Demeter's this chthonic goddess of the underworld, and that's where the nourishment for life comes from. And even that, the separating then, because then there's a way of like making the underworld is a place that is dead, a place where nothing happens, right? A place that to be feared instead of part of this great cycle. Life.
Yeah. A lot of what I've been learning as I've been going through these goddesses of like from all over the world, it's about the cycle, right? And a lot of the patriarchal gods have a very linear kind of way of going about things, whereas the goddess aspect is more like, no, you need the death. Yeah. The death is important. The death is valuable. The death is to be honored. Yeah. The rebirth can't happen without the death, which again, they talk about in Kaos, right? Because there's this idea that harvesting the souls rather than renewing them is creating imbalance in the universe, right?
Yeah. Yes. I love that. Right. And that's that we need death, we need darkness, and we need chaos, right? There are times that are wild, out of control, where we lose ground, where we don't know where up is, and that's where this place of like creative renewal occurs. And these are all the things that I think, more patriarchal societies that have kind of dominated for so long, if I can just use that as a blanket concept, patriarchal, it's more than that, but this idea that we can make things very ordered, that we can create these hierarchical structures, that we can defy death, that we can defy chaos, you know, and then things begin to wane. They pass their prime. And, you know, so we're really ripe for this renewal, which often is going to come through darkness, through chaos, through death, through loss, through change.
Yeah, which is, you know, as a very traditional, especially tantric perspective of the goddesses, the pure energy of everything, the chaos of everything. Like the tantric Shakti is not the controlling force, not the containing force. She's just, you know, the everything of it all. And the masculine principle comes in to order it, right? And it is interesting that at the end of this season of Chaos, you know, we still don't know what chaos with a K actually is. If it's a person, if it's a concept, like it's that's still part of the mystery that I want to know. But, you know, you have Zeus kind of taken down, you have King Minos taken down, you've got Ari in control, you've got Canaeus with this power, you've got Hera with a plan. You don't know what her plan is, but Hera's got a plan. She's like, forget Zeus, I'm going to go be the queen I've always been on my own with my Tacitus, you know. So you do have this sort of feminine shift of power to the feminine and trans characters and away from the men who have been in power for so long. No,
gosh, can we start a petition to get?
I know. My goodness, yeah. I also, you know, when I saw that the series wasn't going to be renewed, I was like, well, maybe I'll put a podcast out and people will listen to it and they'll listen to the series. Yeah. If only I had that kind of power.
I know. Well, do our best. Yeah. Oh.
So many unfinished questions, you know, how did all these characters know? How did Eurydice's mom, you know, somehow know to become a Tacita and then follow this prophecy to take down the gods? Like, how long have the Furies and the Fates been these kind of rebels against the gods? Like, you know, what happens to the Fates? What's Prometheus going to do now? There's just so many unfinished questions.
Right? Right. And Dionysus, that's one that we didn't talk about too. And that's the other thing is like, where's all the other gods? Yeah. Like, where is Artemis? Where's Athena? Where's Ares?
Yeah.
You know, like,
They're referenced, but they're not there.
they're
Yeah. And
never
so, yeah, that's
there.
also a question of like, are we going to get to meet these gods? Like, what are they going to look like? What are their characters going to be?
Right. That's why I was like, who did Hera call at the end? Was that Ares when she's like, gather
Yeah.
the troops? I'm like, okay, who did she call? Or is it
Yeah.
Artemis? I don't know. But Dionysus, that's one thing, one last thing I'd love to know from you. Like, what did you think of that character? Because, first of all, like, I'll just say, as a character in the story, I loved him. He was so sweet. I like, felt so like, I just like, I want to hang out with you. You're just the loveliest. And that he's so intrigued by the topic of love. And that has this shows almost this kind of like disillusionment with like his party life. And like, you know, he's not satisfied. He wants to work with the people more. But also like not how I would have portrayed Dionysus.
Not how I would have portrayed Dionysus.
God, like he wouldn't be that soft. You know?
Yeah, no, yeah. For me, I love Dionysus, the god.
Yes.
And have been learning a little bit more about him too, as not only the god of like pleasure and wildness and vegetation, you know, but also liberation. Like one of his names was Liber, apparently. And you know, he was also the god of altered states of consciousness, which, you know, when you're in an altered state of consciousness and you lose the rules, you can see things from a different perspective. And so that's part of how his role was to be a liberator of the people, to like remember that a lot of these rules are arbitrary, like step outside of them from time to time so that you can remember who you are and your free will and the choices that you have and the possibilities that are out there and so on. And, you know, there's some theories that Dionysus is the originator of the sort of image of the devil that we have today with the horns and the cloven feet. You know, Dionysus had a lot of those qualities, that sort of like half animal sort of thing. And so, you know, there's also this idea of the devil as the rebel, right? The angel that didn't want to follow God's rules, the one that doesn't want God to be in power, right? Which we kind of learn is a bad thing, but from the chaos perspective, it's like, well, maybe, you know, the devil is the liberator. Maybe the devil is the one that's going to take you away, maybe especially from a witchy perspective, like the one that's going to show you the different kinds of powers that you have that aren't within the realm of the patriarchal God, right? And so I feel like, again, maybe in a season 2, Dionysus would have more of a role in disrupting the structure. And I don't think the character was that so much, but I agree. Like, I really liked the character. I liked how human he became, how much he fell in love with the kitten, how like the little black cat, Dennis, was such a part of his learning to love and learning to care. You know, Persephone says at a certain point, the feelings you have for this little animal are not weakness. Like, that is what is powerful. And I feel like, you know, some of the criticism that I heard about Kaos is that it's a little soulless at the beginning, maybe especially because of all the ADHD marvelization, you know, go kind of energy of the first couple of episodes. But then towards the end, it's so much about love. I think it's so much about love being more powerful than than power, right? Than someone being in power, someone having authority.
Yeah. I would have liked to see so many of these characters fleshed out more, and I can imagine they had to pack it in, and I would have loved to see these characters develop. But yeah, in particular, that idea of like liberation, right? Like Dionysus was, again, connected to Orpheus. They were very both connected in this idea of the mystery rites, right? And in both cases, like the Orphic mysteries, it's not a lot is known about it. But this idea, one thing we do know, that at the heart of those mysteries was the use of ecstasis through song, through dance, through poetry, getting into these ecstatic states, you know, these very right brain ecstatic states that pitch you out of the ordered known universe.
And substances, probably.
And likely substances as well.
Yeah.
Definitely what they know is a heavy use of plant medicines in the form of the burning of incenses. And this is like huge amounts of incense that would have had an intoxicating effect. That for sure. And we know with Dionysus, it's the wine, right? And the wine,
right.
You know, many studies have been done on the wine that was used was not just wine. Often many plants were infused into the wine and all of that. But a big use, which is a big part of Greek culture to this day, but definitely a huge part of ancient Greek culture, was getting into these altered states through song, dance, revelry, long performance of rituals through singing and dancing and, you know, fasting and excess of food and drink and staying up late and all those things. So you get into these states that pitch you into another way of knowing something, this sort of gnosis that is not possible when we're in the ordered realm, right? And that those mysteries were the things that were stamped out with the growing empire, especially when we came into like the combination of like Christian and Roman Empire. Those were the things that were stamped out because these were these places and these great mystery schools where people had this direct experience of what it is to be both human, very human, like of this world. These are deeply animist rites and rituals and cultures, but also to be divine, which is, often the idea that humans have the access to both. And I loved in Kaos how at the end, I think it is Persephone that says to Dionysus, do I have this right? Like maybe the best part of you is human.
Yeah, I think she says something like that. Yeah.
Right. So I loved that Dionysus and Orpheus were friends in Kaos, right? That shows that they have that deep connection, which they did in the ancient world. And I would have loved to have seen how, in particular, Dionysus's story would have unfolded, because I definitely got the idea when he's like down in earth at the end with, his meander water in his hand, and he's, his dad just killed his kitten and burned his mom, where he's like, okay, like he was going to do something subversive, and I wanted to see what it was going to be.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, Zeus took it too far for so many of them. Everybody was ready to rebel, right? I want to see it. Yeah.
Right. And that was the brilliance of his character, rather. We needed to see how psycho he was, right? It's like, okay, like he's terrifying. He got like really terrifying.
And casting Jeff Goldblum as a psychopath was such an intelligent move, I think, because it's so hard to not like Jeff Goldblum. Like, even in these moments where he's doing these horrible things, you can't help but like him a little bit. There's just something so charming about Jeff Goldblum. So I feel like he tempered, from that dark comedy perspective, he tempered some of the horrible things he was doing just by the way he kind of shows his insecurity, even as he's doing these horrible things, like shooting the ball boys off the roof, this really extreme way. And then he finds out the ball boys had nothing to do with it, and he just goes, oops.
That was brilliant casting. I loved that character, even though it's like, oh God. And that's the idea, right? That he is a kind of ambiguous character in that way, because Zeus often is portrayed as this terrible character, but then of course he also represents a lot of things that are benefic,
Right.
So, yeah. And so I think it was like really excellent casting.
Yeah.
Well, either way, like, look how much conversation it sparked here. And, this, I hope that, like I said, many people, even just like hearing this and watching that show, will just return to the myths, and it just gets, the mind turning like you are with your amazing retellings that you're writing. I can't wait, Julie.
I'll send you a copy right away.
I cannot wait.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Natalie, for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your perspectives and the stories and everything. I feel like we could talk about this for another hour. We probably shouldn't. But it's been such a delight to be able to chat with you about all this.
Thanks. That was really,
yeah. And anything you want to share about like where people can find you, or
Yeah, they can find me online. Just Google my name. Pretty easy. Yeah.
Lots of courses at different times of the year that are available, and also as a counselor, people can get in touch with you and have a little bit of that archetypal perspective maybe in their therapy, which I think is so valuable too.
It's just like it's always there in my own life, in the way that I live my life, and the work that I do in my counseling, working as a relational somatic therapist. We work so much in that right brain realm, and so it's more like the images that come forward from within each person hold a lot of information that our left brain logical way of knowing can't always access, as you know, being a tarot reader. And so there's a lot of crossover in that way, and it's not that I'm bringing the gods or the myths directly into my counseling work, but it's that same idea of thinking in a symbolic way, but really listening for an individual person's.
Before therapy, there was mythology, right? Thank you so much, Natalie. We'll talk soon. Bye. So I hope you enjoyed that conversation with the wonderful Natalie Rousseau. I'm going to give you her information in the show notes so that you can look her up if you want more information from her. You will be hearing more about my books that are going to be coming out in 2025 and beyond. So stay tuned for that. You can follow me at Julie Peters Wellness on Instagram, to Popcorn Therapy on TikTok. You can go to my website, juliepeters.ca, if you want more information about tarot or counseling or anything like that. And if there is a petition, let's sign it. Maybe let's start one. Let's get another season of Kaos going. Okay. Thanks so much, everybody.
Soundstripe.